Hello dear chess friends, I'm International Master Andrei Ostrovsky and you're welcome to the fourth lesson of the series dedicated to the importance of the center in chess. In this lesson we will talk about the meaning of central squares to the attack. In this first position we can see that white has much more active pieces. Pay attention to the central squares. White has a better access to central squares. White has a better control of central squares, and pawn on d5 occupies central d5 square. It is a passed pawn, so it is potentially a dangerous one. But at the same time, there is also a drawback because the pawn occupies the square, which could have been occupied by the piece instead. And in such a situation, there is a typical method just to sacrifice this pawn in order to make central squares free to occupy with other pieces. In this particular case, it works just perfectly. White makes very aggressive d6 move, and now we can see the point. So it is a tempo move, so black has no time for protecting d5 square, which means that the knight will inevitably occupy d5 next move. By the way, it is already a threat of a fork from d5 to attack the queen and the bishop, so this forces black to take on d6 with the bishop, exactly to save the material. So knight goes to d5 with the tempo, great attacking move. Now the knight is very active here on d5. At the same time, we can see that bishop b2 is activated as well. It exerts very great pressure on black's king side. Queen goes to d7, and now white, without any hesitation, puts the knight on f6. And that is another important moment. So we already discussed the flexibility of central squares. We discussed that from central squares it is really easy to get to other squares on the side, and here it is exactly the demonstration of this feature. So knight went to d5, not to stay there for a long time, but just to go further. It goes to f6 with a great efficiency. So after g takes f6, which was forced, bishop takes f6, and we can see that black's position is so bad that he simply has no defense against white's numerous threats. So the rook on d8 is hanging, but white's main target is of course black's king, which is now completely exposed. So after b5, queen h5, there is already a threat of a queen g5 checkmate. Only defense for black is knight to e7 to have knight g6, but queen goes to g5 anyway, attacking the king and forcing the knight to g6. And now rook takes d6, for example, and white has simply decisive material advantage as a result. So a pawn sacrifice to make central square free for own pieces, then occupation of the central square, and then this piece goes further. So using the central square to get to the side. Let's have a look on the other example. This position arose in the game between Steinitz and Bardeleben, a classic example and a very nice combination. We can see that in this position we have a materially balanced situation. However, white's pieces are much more active and better coordinated. Black's king is stuck in the center. It's not easy for black to solve the problem of the king because white attacks e7 knight with both the queen and the rook. So whenever king goes away from e8 somewhere to the side, white simply captures the knight. So this means white has some time to come up with active play. White has some time to improve the position and to make it more aggressive. We can see that probably having all three heavy pieces on the e-file is not that efficient idea in this case because it takes time, and after that black will probably play king f7, then rook to e8, and this will help black to protect the knight and then maybe to simplify position after the knight goes away somewhere, or to make a manual castling. So this looks just very slow for this position. Another idea is to connect the knight somehow to the attack, but we can see that central square e5, which is quite typical outpost for the knight in this situation, is controlled by pawn f6, so it's not that easy to get to this square. As for another possible central square for the knight, I mean d4, it is now engaged with the pawn. So again, white uses the same method and plays d5. Very nice move. A pawn sacrifice with the idea to make d4 square free to occupy with the knight. after which this knight will become just a beast. Moreover, in this concrete case, after d5, c takes d5 is more or less forced, which leads to opening of the c file and makes white's position even more promising, because the more open position becomes, the easier for white to attack, the more squares are possible to occupy, and so on. The knight goes to d4, of course. That was the idea behind d5 sacrifice. And now there is a threat of knight f5, just winning material, because if queen takes the knight, then simply queen takes e7. That's a problem for black, so king f7 is simply forced. And once again, just like in the previous example, white went to d4, not to stay there, but to go further immediately. So knight goes to e6. Best possible position for the knight. Now it is very active here and has great access to different squares on both sides. So we can see knight controls c7 square, creating a threat of rook c7, for example. Knight controls g7 square, which is also very important because white can attack g7 next move by maneuvering the queen somewhere to the g file, for instance. It also controls d8 and f8 squares that are possible for black's pieces to occupy at some point. So this knight just becomes a great power here and simply decides the game. So black played very natural rook c8, intending king g8, just making this manual castling, and also controlling c file, controlling c7 square, so preventing white's activity along this file. But queen g4, very strong attacking move, just creating sort of a queen g7, but not only, because now the knight g5 is also a threat, attacking the king and the queen simultaneously. And it appears black has no suitable defense. He just played g6 to protect g7. Now knight goes to g5 check, forcing the king back to the ugly central position on e8, and rook takes e7. Just a decisive combination, which looks like immediately devastating, but the things are not so easy, in fact. So definitely after king e7, white wins on the spot, so rook goes to e1, and if king goes to d8, let's say, knight e6 check, king goes to e7, and then knight goes to c5 check from the rook, and queen is hanging. If queen takes on e7, this loses a control over diagonal h3 c8, so white simply takes the rook and has a decisive material advantage. But one of a sudden, after rook e7, black played king to f8, leaving everything hanging, but we can see that white also has some problems, especially with the back rank. So rook on c1 is hanging, and for instance, if white takes the queen, then after rook c1 it is just a checkmate. So instead of doing that, of course, white continued his brilliant combination. Like Steinitz said after the game, everything was predicted. So rook goes to f7 now, check. King goes to g8. Rook goes to g7, another brilliant move. The point here that rook is completely invulnerable. If queen takes the rook, then the same, just like we discussed, rook takes c8, winning the game. And whenever king occupies 7th rank, then white has the time for taking the queen, because in that case it will be a tempo move and winning position. So king is forced moving further, rook takes h7, then again rook to g7, and now the point h file is opened, so white has a chance to continue the attack with the queen, and white builds up a checkmating mechanism. King f8, queen h8 check, king goes to e7, queen goes to g7, king goes to e8, now queen goes to g8, king e7, queen f7, and finally after king d8, just queen f8 check, forcing the queen to e8 and checkmate into moves. Knight f7 check, and queen goes to d6. Well, so here we saw a brilliant combination that actually started with white's energetic d5 move, and white had the same idea, just to free the central square for the piece. For this purpose, white sacrifices a pawn, just moves this pawn further, and after occupation of this central square, the piece doesn't stay there for a long time, but goes further, creating decisive threats. So let's have a look on the other example. This position arose in the game Pilnik-Geller, and having in mind previous examples, I guess you expect something like e4 move here, and you're right completely, because this move appears the most efficient. So the idea is the same. Black has a good control over the center at the moment, but all the center is occupied with pawns, not with pieces, and we already saw the meaning of central squares for the pieces. So whenever you have a chance to do this typical sacrifice, you have to consider it. And Geller came up with this e4 move. It is a tempo move because black creates a positional threat of just capturing the bishop, making white's pawn structure on the queen's side completely damaged and vulnerable. So white is forced to take the bishop on f6. Queen takes f6, and now pawn takes e4. And the difference compared to the previous examples is that at the moment black has no chance to occupy central square e5 with the knight immediately, because there is a problem with the f5 pawn. So what to do with that? Of course, not to take on e4 because queen is heading on f6, but to play f4. Very nice move. Black just grabs the space on the king side. As you can see, black tries to place all the pawns on dark squares so that they won't be accessible for white's light squared bishop. Very nice. And the bishop has also problems with the activity because almost all white's pawns are placed on light squares, so it is kind of self-limitation. So in this position, after rook f2, knight goes to e5, and now we can see the point of the whole operation. It is a bit different if compared to previous examples, of course, but the form of this operation was the same. So sacrifice of the pawn to make the central square free, and then the occupation of this central square with the piece, which becomes extremely active. So here we can see the knight is really a beast here on e5. It blockades white's pawn e4, which means this bishop c2 will be never active in this game. And also this knight supports black's attack on the king side, because pawn f4 in addition to g6 and h7 creates a pawn majority on the king side now against pawns g2 and h2, because e4 pawn here means nothing. So the knight simply supports a future f3 breakthrough, for instance. So black's task is just to coordinate all the pieces on the king side and to attack. But what is the difference compared to previous examples? Here the knight won't be that active immediately, so it will be just on e5 for quite a long time, simply supporting the attack, and only when everything will be ready, he can join the attack. As you can see, it still has an access to squares on the king side, quite quickly can be maneuvered to f3 or g4 whenever it is possible. And again, this just proves the flexibility of the central position. So after rook f1, queen went to h4, bishop d1, rook to f7, preparing another rook to f8, and after queen c2 and g5, everything became clear. So black's direct attack on the king side is just a question of several moves. For example, it's necessary to have the rook on f8. In many cases, it's not a big problem. If white plays something like h3, well, it's again not a problem because black has this h5 resource, and then sooner or later black just plays g4, if necessary f3. If white takes on g4 and black takes on g4, there is another motive of using the h file, which becomes open, and also there is an additional possibility for black to attack with the help of g3, attacking h2 square. So pay attention to the difference of minor pieces in this situation. So black's crazy active knight e5, which is very nice, very efficient in the sense of attacking, supporting the attack, and at the same time stopping all possible white's counterplay in the center, blockading the center, and just the bishop on d1 that is very passive, limited with own pawns, and just has no perspectives at all. By the way, this example is just the opposite to the one we saw in the previous lesson, when Tal started the attack on this side, having no control over the center. So here it is completely different. So prior to attacking somewhere black solved all the problems with the center. So here black decided to blockade the center completely, but of course to have the knight a great centralized piece here. So this means black has a complete control over the center. Nothing can happen here, and black simply attacks on the king side. This attack looks devastating and pretty much automatic. Thanks for your attention. See you next lessons.